Good.
Okay, I accept.
We're here with a very esteemed friend, a long-term American expat in Paris, an expert on all things emerging in France and Israel, as a matter of course. And she is a well-published author. Her articles have appeared in a number of important outlets, the Wall Street Journal in Europe, Rishon Makor, or Makor Rishon, however you pronounce that. She is a fellow colleague with the New English Review. Nidra, we're here to begin a rather interesting dialogue about the rather controversial intellectual columnist, TV raconteur, who turns out to be the son of Algerian Jewish refugees who came to France in the 50s. And his name is Eric Zemmour. And one of the purposes, if not the most significant of this interview, is to get down to the nub of the controversy surrounding him, dismiss things that are misinformation, and also zero in on those things that are factual. So we know that he's risen in the polls. He does not have a party as of yet. He has had a round of public meetings to enthusiastic crowds. And he was on the equivalent, they say here in the United States, of something called C News for a while. And that has apparently been a former platform for him. He is an accomplished debater. He can destroy essentially public figures, including current leaders of contending French parties. So with that background, why don't we delve directly into your views about Mr. Zemmour?
We will, but I would like first to maybe correct some impressions from our last interview. Remember, I wanted to say that France was on the front lines in the fight against Islamization. And so I don't want to give a false impression that somehow France is handling this with wonderful mastery, and that other places are suffering and we know how to deal with it. And also, as I sometimes go in different areas of the city, I think to myself, do I give the wrong impression? There are plenty of problems here. That's concrete reality. And there are problems of unassimilated immigration. There are problems of illegal immigration. There are problems of terrible violence, terrible the drug traffic has just gone crazy. Every single day you read about a few people killed. They kill each other, over that. So that's something that I want to be sure that I'm not giving the wrong impression, because myself here in this room where I'm speaking to you, everything is quiet and orderly. The other thing I want to say is that debate, I love debate, and debate is to clarify things. It's to bring light to subjects. And the kind of controversy that seems to be favored these days, it does the opposite. The shouting matches, and then it just, it covers the other person with mud, and it covers the reality and distorts everything. And then there's a kind of false debate where the person has a false foregone conclusion and simply twists the terms of the debate as they go along, not really listening to what you say and then saying what he thinks, twist it in order to win something that the person planned to win from the beginning. And that is perhaps my first reserve about Eric Zemmour. I feel that he is a false debater, and that he has something in the background that's pushing him to arrive at a certain conclusion. And so he twists the terms as he goes along. And this is why when he was having the most active program on C News, I didn't find much interest in listening because of this. There was always something kind of, provocative, sticking a knife in or else coming out with something outrageous. This is mainly his way of functioning, is to come out with something outrageous. Then I would like to say that I feel absolutely assailed by the false comparisons that are going around. This last week, preparing for our interview, I read a lot of articles in French and in English, but especially in English. And it's coming, oh yes, Eric Zemmour is the Trump of France, and he's like Tucker Carlson, and C News is Fox News. I want to say that there is absolutely no comparison, right? And I feel like we're battered with this and flooded with it. There's no comparison. And if you notice, this is being said over and over and over again. They don't go into the details, because if they went into the details, they wouldn't be able to defend the comparison. What I don't understand, what is the purpose of it? Sometimes in journalism, the purpose is simply to say what others say, and one says it, and then the others say it, and then they all repeat it. So I would like it to be clear. There is no comparison with Trump. There is no comparison with Tucker Carlson. There is no comparison with Fox News. I don't know if you can't understand French. I think you could watch Say News for a whole day, and you would see that there's no comparison with Fox News. So let's go on to the next point I prepared this time. Alors, another thing that you read very often is that Eric Zemmour is the first one to speak out on these questions. But Jerry, you know, because we've been working together for 20 years, we have been speaking out on these questions for 20 years. Some people have been speaking out for 30 years, 40 years, and the dozens and dozens of people have been writing about these questions, speaking about these questions. I'm not the least of them. And I think it would be good at the end of this interview to give some of the book titles, something like The Black Flag of Jihad Stalks La République. So the question is, what's the difference between all of us? What's the difference between Eric Zemmour and a brilliant historian, Georges Bensoussan, who's been speaking out and who has suffered much more attempts at censorship than Eric Zemmour? So we have to look at that. Well, what is the difference, and what is it that's making Eric Zemmour's discourse translate into what looks like political power, whereas all of the serious writers that have been working on it all of these years are limited to a very small audience usually. And I think one of the elements is these little knife stabs that he sticks in every time he speaks. He sticks in a few things that are so outrageous, and then everybody talks about them. And then it kind of, builds up, we say, makes the mayonnaise build up, right? So another interesting aspect is that many of us that spoke out decades ago, anti-Semitism was the first evidence of the Islamization of the jihad that was going to strike France. And it started with this anti-Semitism. But Eric Zemmour at that time did not want to speak out as Jewish because he wants to be primarily French, more French than the French. Perhaps it's something to do with the kind of complex of immigrants that want to be so proud of the country that they belong to. Well, but of course, the Jews in Algeria were French, since the Decret Cramieux. But this certainly is one of the elements. So then you get the other kind of cliches. He's a pundit. Well, it's true that he had, a big presence in the media, but he's a writer. He writes big, heavy, thick books. And I haven't read them, I will readily admit. And I have read enough about them to sense, and I would have to test it, of course, that he's a sort of historian without really being solidly a historian. And he has this intellectual dishonesty. But first of all, he's an intellectual. When I hear that comparison with Trump, I'm saying, what are they talking about? Trump never read a book, and Eric Zemmour writes big, thick, heavy books. And he's known as a writer. And people come and buy his books, and he signs his books, and he's not just a TV star. And he has strictly nothing to do with Trump. He's a sovereign, if you want. He's not extreme right. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not a xenophobe. He's not a racist. He's not a misogynist. He's a sovereignist and a very strong nationalist. And he writes on these subjects that many, many, many of us have been writing. For example, he's not against homosexuals, but he says there's a lobby, an LGBT lobby. He would, write about woke. The French are very, very much involved in trying to stop woke from waking us up here or putting us to sleep, if you might say. So you don't need the cliches from the right, from the left, from the center about them. So let's say a bit more about this intellectual dishonesty, which is my real concern with Eric Zemmour. On these controversial things like the role of Pétain, so-called in saving the French Jews, or the innocence of Captain Dreyfus. What is he looking for when he questions the innocence of Captain Dreyfus? Some people who know quite a bit about his intellectual development think that he is really making an appeal to this ultra-right segment of French political life with things like this. One writer has said that he spent a lot of time with Jean-Marie Le Pen. More probably important is that he is gaining quite a bit of support from Marion Maréchal Le Pen. And here we have this sordid Le Pen family with the father disowning his daughter, who's sort of, now she's kind of worn around the edges. She gave up the arguments that drew people to her party, and she's been sort of floating around since, trying to find some kind of center. But Marion Maréchal is young, she's more blonde, she's more young, and the grandfather reportedly is very close to her, and she is very close to his ideas, and there's a definite rivalry between Marine Le Pen and her niece, Marion Maréchal. And Zemmour went to Hungary just recently to see Orban with Marion Maréchal Le Pen. Then we have this other aspect of his nationalism. And we saw this coming from Israel as well. The allusions about Central Europe. So if Poland and Hungary have a strong policy against Islamization and ask for a certain degree of sovereignty with regard to the European Union, then the nationalists start to have confidence in them. And no sooner do they have confidence in them that Poland starts to pass laws, where you can't say that they were involved in the extermination of the Jews, and then they get angry about the restitution of Jewish property. And Orban is not, I don't think Orban is so trustworthy. But again, what's going on in our democracies that if somebody just agrees with you on 3 points, you're ready to kiss the person's feet. And what's happening to our conservative movements if someone like Trump and someone like Zemmour can come along and they're obvious either, very serious character defects are obvious from the beginning, and suddenly that's the leader maximo, and now you're not allowed to criticize them. I have read virulent things in French by someone who also writes in English, but virulent things against the French Jews that dare not to be enchanted with Eric Zemmour. So I see behind all of this also a very serious problem in our democracies. Personally, if someone on the far left or someone on the left or middle that I never would have an enthusiasm for has these kinds of character problems, it doesn't hurt me so much. It's a bit like when you're Jewish and there's a Jewish criminal, it feels worse than if it's a non-Jewish criminal because you feel some kind of collective responsibility, perhaps. So if I can't find a political leader that I can admire and respect, then I don't let them be elected because it's not just me. We're in a democracy. The people vote. No matter what I think, no matter what I write, in the end, the people vote and they usually don't agree with me. And I have to accept. So I don't see the need to get enchanted with someone like Eric Zemmour. Why not just be reasonable about him? But that doesn't seem to be the way it goes. Let's talk about the political aspect of not having a party. Emmanuel Macron was in politics. He wasn't in elected office, but he was in politics. He created a party just to get elected as president, and he slipped in at a time when François Fillon would have been elected on the conservative right, the legitimate or the parliamentary right. Fillon was eliminated in a very unfair way over a scandal that really amounts to nothing. And Macron became president. But Macron's party had no national network. And to this day, they do not have it. The last regional elections were won by the parliamentary right, not by the left, not by the party of Marine Le Pen, and not by the party of Macron. Zemmour has even less of a political structure, no political experience, and no party. And I just would like to ask the people that are now panting over him, whether they're from a distance in the United States or here in France, how in the world do they think he could govern without a party? In France, we have the presidential election and then very shortly after, the legislative election. Our legislature isn't nearly as powerful as Congress, but still, unless you want a dictator, he rules with he governs, excuse me, he doesn't rule, he governs with the legislature. How in the world would he win any legislative elections with no party? You can't, from now till May, you can't create a party. Marine Le Pen hasn't managed to create a party. So that point, and then.
But while you're searching, what has been the reaction of what I would call the acknowledged French community commentators? Let's start with what is called the consistoire, the CRIF leadership.
No, that's the CRIF is civil society. Yes. It represents, it's like the presidents of the major Jewish organization or something. It's a loosely collected. Okay, the president of the CRIF came out and said, no Jews should vote for Zemmour. That's not exactly their role, but that's not true to say that they never did it before. I've heard that, I've read it by people who should know better. They don't care that it's not true because they want it to be true. This is something that I find very painful. Okay, they have said that about the far left, La France Insoumise. They have said it about the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen's party. So for the head of the CRIF to say that, it's not unusual, and it's not, it's his opinion. It's not, there's no kind of, nobody controls the Jewish vote, and the Jewish vote is very small in France. So but that's the position. And within the community, I think it's very divided and it's debated. There are people that went along to a certain point and then started to get dubious about, as these provocations, like they would say, well, what he said about Pétain, okay, maybe. When he says we're not sure about the innocence of Capitaine Dreyfus, then why in the world, what is he looking for? Who is he trying to attract? He's certainly not looking for the truth. The truth has been established, right? It's like the revisionists about the death counts. They say we should be able to debate it. Well, there's nothing to debate about that, right? So they don't want to debate it. They want to lie, and they want people to say that the lie is the truth. So why would he say that? Then there are people, today, I'm sorry to say, people have become so tribal that if someone says, I know someone who said, Zemmour is going to win in a landslide. And any Jew that doesn't recognize that he's the one for us is, we're stupid, or we're evil, or we're blind, or we're the handmaidens of something. He's not going to win in a landslide. And you cut off all, so maybe people don't talk about it so much, but within the Jewish intellectual community, you have many, many articles solidly written for and against Zemmour. It's quite open debate. There is you could never say that there's some wholehearted following among the Jews or among any sector. I would like to underline something too that maybe Americans don't know. The campaign officially has not started. It starts in January. The parliamentary right doesn't have a candidate yet. They have 4 or 5 competing candidates, and that will be decided on the 4th of December. So Zemmour is not competing with somebody who's already named as the candidate, and we don't know how the parliamentary right is going to mobilize behind the person that's chosen as the candidate and what the issues will be. Zemmour certainly is functioning as a gadfly on questions of immigration and security and LGBT and ultra-feminism, though on those, marriage for homosexual marriage and all of those questions that have been circulating in the last few years and we've been writing about and I've been writing about, but I don't get any 17% of votes on polls. Let me say something about the polls. The polls say that Zemmour is something like 17, 18%. The polls say that on the second round, Macron will win. The commentators admire or are dazzled by this Zemmour that came out of nowhere to have 17%. But the fact that he's going to lose, if you watch it's the same polls, if the polls say he's going to lose, then that they don't seem to want to acknowledge that. Yeah. So I would say every sector, the polls, to the extent they can analyze, say that some of the vote is coming from the parliamentary right voters, some from the Rassemblement National, some from the left. And yes.
Keeping that in mind, there are certain mechanics I've gotten to know about how he could possibly run, not unlike the Macron situation. Is there a requirement for him to sign up several hundred of French mayors in order to file?
Yes, 500.
And has that effort begun yet, or is it
Yes, yes.
And how many does he have in his wicket?
I don't know to date. There was a little while back, there was talk of about 200. Then if he's officially declares, he does it always in a coy way, like, well, if I don't run, people are going to be disappointed. So there is that requirement, but having a party isn't a requirement. But I mean, having a party is more, if you don't have a party, you can't govern. You can't govern.
Well, not only that, but he also has to have the funding to do this. And
yes. And you're right, the funding for where he is now, he has some wealthy people, but then the funding for the campaign, again, if you don't have a structure, I would like now to mention something. Did you see the photo of him at the military, not military, but security show in Paris a few weeks ago?
Oh, you mean Milipo?
Yes.
Milipo, yes.
You're up on everything, Jerry. All right. Eric Zemmour picked up a sniper rifle.
Correct.
That if he put it standing, it was about as tall as he is. He touched it up, and then he picked it up, and then he thought he was holding it. And I don't know very much about arms, but I looked and I said, he doesn't know how to hold a gun. And then he said to the journalists that were around him, step back, step back. This was about 2 days before Alec Baldwin shot the director of the show he was, of the film he was with.
Yeah.
You don't do that. What I saw was, first of all, that he talks about security, but he doesn't know what he's talking about, that he doesn't understand power, that he's a fake, because there he was in front of everything he does is watched, and he didn't know, he didn't properly judge anything. Okay, now we've talked about this before, because we write. It's one thing to write about the problems and give your analysis and say, I think this or that. It's another thing to govern. Now, can you imagine somebody who makes a mistake like that? And then how would he deal with in international relations? How would he defend the country? I mean, maybe Macron was not exactly what anybody wants. Or half the people vote for him. Maybe he's not what, but he has a certain sense of how you behave in public, right? Okay, so that's one thing. And then I want to tell you how I first heard about Eric Zemmour. He wrote a book called Petit Frère, Little Brother. It was published in 2008. I thought it was earlier, but I don't think I'd ever heard of him before. And when I heard about this book, I was very shocked because you remember we were together at Harvard when the news came of the murder of Selam, Sebastian Selam, the DJ.
Yep.
Remember, I announced it when I spoke, and somebody in the audience, and a French woman living in the United States, said it's not true. When I returned to Paris, I got in touch with the family, mom's brother. And she handled a lot, she was very sophisticated, and she handled a lot of the attempts to get recognition that this was an anti-Semitic murder. And in the book, Zemmour, it's a novel, he invented a love affair between Laetitia and her brother-in-law, Sebastian Ruthke. And he was challenged on that. I remember that. He was challenged on that. And he said, oh, but you know, all the great authors, they did works of fiction based on real crime stories. And I thought then, I do nothing about him. I thought, how pretentious. I don't get the impression he's a great author. And this story was still warm. And he invented a terrible lie about my friend Laetitia Salam. This leads us to, so you see, what was his attitude at that time to what was happening to French Jews? As I understand it, it was more like there's identity pressure on both sides, right? The Jews are pushing their identity and the Muslims are pushing their identity, and it's clashing. So he wasn't so concerned about the anti-Semitism that was blossoming in those days. And this brings us to two other contemporary things that are in the news right now. The trial of the murderers of Maréchal,
Correct.
and the parliamentary hearings on what went wrong in the judicial handling of the murder of Sarah Halimi. And I thought of something that brings them together. Sebastian Selam, Maréchal, Ilan Halimi are people that trusted their Muslim neighbors, or Ilan trusted a Muslim chick that came to get him, how do we say, draguer, to seduce him, okay? Mm-hmm. And it was a sign of the fact that there wasn't strict separation. People trusted their neighbors. Maréchal, in her 80s, bedridden, all her life, she had trusted this young man since he was a kid. And he not only killed her, but this was an Islamic murder. The murder of Sebastian Selam was a totally Islamic murder. And to this day, it hasn't been properly recognized. not widely, so many people do know, but not widely recognized. So in the case of Mireille, officials and people in the Jewish community, spokesmen, there wasn't any doubt. Right away, it was labeled anti-Semitic. The murder of Sarah Halimi, in her case, she wasn't trusting her Muslim neighbor, but she had no choice. She was living there, and her Muslim neighbor knew where to find her. You can, I will send you the link if you haven't found it already. Of course, you have to be able to follow it in French, but the entire hearing is available on video. And so now I've started to watch it, and you get all the details. So the idea that there was a failure of the judicial system in this case, it's not just something thrown out. It's not said because they want to say it because they want the man to have been put on trial. It's because they have endless details about how it was mishandled. So that's fascinating. And they will make a report. It's going on until January, and then they will make a report to the parliament. It might help, but it's very much a question. In the case of Sarah Halimi, it's a question of the investigating judge. It's a very personal thing. This is something in the antiquated system, legal system in France, that one person like that can mishandle the entire trial, the entire case, and you just can't ever get it back on the rails. But I've given you a lot of material, and I'd like to take some questions if you have, because I need to know a bit more, what all of this looks like coming from your side.
Well, from our side here in the US, the appeal that Zemmour has in particular is, as you said earlier, rather tribal. There is obviously a concept known as psychological set. Having seen the performance, if you want to call it that, of former President Trump, the immediate response here is he is the French Trump. And as you correctly point out, he is not what Trump is. But
I wish they would, I wish, Jerry, that they would explain when they say things like that. What do they mean by he's the French Trump? I really wish somebody would explain to me what they mean. What do you understand by it?
I think they superimpose on Mr. Zemmour the fact that he is against a number of, shall we say, values that we hold dearly here in the US, perhaps not much anymore, that resonate with Zemmour's remarks. The other thing that has come to the fore here, particularly in what I would call the Jewish social media outlets, is really the characterization of Zemmour of being not only very far to the right, but also callously treating events. One in particular that caught my attention was his remarks concerning the unfortunate, appalling murder in Toulouse.
Yes.
The Al-Qaeda,
Yeah.
self-styled Al-Qaeda operative, Mr. Mohammed Merah.
Yeah.
He murders gratuitously, I thought, what was it, 3 young children who were being taken to a Jewish day school in Toulouse.
Mm-hmm.
Zemmour raises the question of why were they buried in Israel instead of France?
Yes.
And I just found it absurd and callous, particularly in light of the manner in which the murder was conducted. And by the way, as you and I both know, not only were those 3 children taken out, but so were several French soldiers who happened to be Muslim, as it turned out.
Yes, and one is entier. He's not dead, but he's so handicapped, it's heartbreaking.
Yes, very
That's
much.
what misled the police, because first he killed the soldiers on
Yeah,
two different occasions and with a gun. And we hadn't had Islamic murders with guns. And that misled people. And that gave him time. And of course, they didn't properly investigate things they could have investigated. And that led him. And then the little girl, the daughter of the school director that he killed her, grabbed her. She was running away, grabbed her by the hair and shot her in the head. And Ilan Halimi is buried in Israel, and the victims of the Iber Kasher,
right.
Kurban's victims are buried there. And it's something like the thing about naming. You see, if you take my friends, Jewish friends that are between 60 and 80, they have French names, almost all of them. But when they have the younger ones, they have Hebrew names. But he doesn't talk about it. But we know that he means it. When he talks about Muhammad, he also means Aryeh and Gabriel and Abishai and so on. That they should be named Jean-Pierre and Jean-Philippe. And so what is that about? What is that about? Who is he trying to attract? I don't put labels, I don't say that he's anti-Semitic or xenophobic or racist, but as with Trump, you can be personally none of those things, but you can attract them. The same as certain politicians in our democracies. They're not jihadists, but they see a vote from the jihad sector of their country and they do things to attract that vote. So what does that mean when you attract it? If you would say he's the French Trump, what do you mean? That we could expect him to get elected, not do hardly anything he promised? Where's the wall that Mexico was going to pay for? And mess up on one thing after the other and end up with an insurrection to take over the country. I don't think it's a favor to say that he's a French Trump. But beyond that, it's that we're assailed with texts to read. And nobody can find the time to read 1/5 of what comes in every day. And so I feel like I'm being tricked because I said, oh, okay, let me see this. And I end up with all of these cliches, all of this repetition, and nothing developed. So let me go back to you. So the idea that he's the French Trump, it's like the idea that Say News is Fox News. You can't develop the idea. If we can't think clearly, how in the world are we going to find a way out of the terrible problems that are facing our democracies? And that's the danger in democracy. If your population isn't educated and can't think, then they're subject to charlatans. Bad politicians is bad enough, and there are plenty. But anyway, is it right in our day and age to think that the president is the one that's going to solve everything? Or do we have to think about the whole body politic, the whole society? What can we do? Right? Because if the society is falling apart, the president can't solve anything. For one man to manage a multinational is almost impossible. How can you expect someone to manage everything in a country? It's an idea. The president is like an idea that you have up there. Yeah. So how do you feel about this information that you're getting from all sides?
Well, from my vantage point personally, I find it intriguing to a degree that Mr. Zemmour, essentially, who came from Algerian Jewish Berber background, basically has been seized essentially by the right or extreme right in some instances as being their savior from the grand replacement. That's the other catchphrase that is used here that has been adopted in that regard. And that speaks to the question of the dynamics that characterize the so-called Trump base in the Republican Party at this point in time. The other is the fact that, frankly, those of us who are politically astute and know what the mechanics are, that if you really don't have an organization, a staff of talent that can assist you in getting stuff organized and conducted, putting out themes that make appeals to significant voting blocs in the country, then you're not going to succeed eventually. The other thing that's apparent is something that came up, in my view, the other day concerning Mr. Zemmour. He has a 28-year-old French Jewish staffer. And there's the intimation that there, quote, may be a relationship between the 63-year-old guy and this younger gal. And I just think that just takes away from the credibility of the situation for many of us.
There's going to be a program on this evening, sort of exposés or what. There are people who know more and people who know less. In France, you know, we don't have this family-style elections. The candidate doesn't come with holding hands with his wife and then the children lined up and so on and telling how wonderful their father is or mother, if that would be the case. So I didn't know anything about his personal life. And I read this week that he has a proper wife who's a lawyer and 3 adult children. And the wife has never appeared in any way in any of these meetings, which are, you know, promoting his book and at the same time taking the form of campaign meetings. And there were 2 points of view of the Paris Match story. One point of view was he deliberately let them have this information so that he would have the macho appeal, and that would appeal to the French that like to have their politicians having a way with women. But the editor was fired, and that was a different version, was that Macron or someone connected to Macron deliberately manipulated to get that story in to make him look bad. The age difference, of course, in France, well, as people point out, the wife of our president is much older than him, and that didn't prevent him from getting elected. But they were legally married at the time. We don't know if they cheated on anybody before since. We have our President Hollande had his girl, remember they called her the first girlfriend, and he cheated on her while she was in the as the first girlfriend, and then he sort of kicked her out. So I guess you could say that this could be an advantage or disadvantage, but to us, it could be also an example of a lack of integrity. We have the right? It's debatable. We have the right to say that some people might think it's cute, but we might think it's a lack of integrity because there's a wife somewhere that is getting deeply insulted. And he knew this young lady when she was 13.
Wow.
She's the daughter of a friend. which makes it almost, like pedophilia. It's very lovely, lovely looking young lady. Anyway, I'll watch the expose and I don't know, we'll get tired of the subject. I think we'll try next month to look into some other questions. I think that our respective presidents made up after the submarine fiasco, so we're okay on that. They can't afford to stay angry.
That was going to be my final question for you. There was this rather interesting picture of the two of them from the back engaging in what we call a bromance. After President Biden sheepishly says, well, the whole thing with the AUKUS treaty and the submarine deal was, quote, clumsily handled. All that does back here in the United States is say, how competent is Mr. Biden in essentially conducting international affairs? That's an observation.
Well, that's the question. How about another kind of president that said, oh, I made a great deal. Oh, it was wonderful. Everybody thinks what I did was great. Oh, this was fantastic. Maybe it's not so bad, but anyway, they have to make up and be friends. What do you think? We can't.
But the other aspect of that is the question.
It was very awkwardly handled, that's true, but it wasn't just Biden. It was, what's happening today? The British and the French are fighting about the fishing rights. It's getting, the channel is boiling.
That the British are suggesting that they're going to seize French vessels too.
And the French are going to close the ports and maybe we'll go to war in the English Channel. That will give us a nice subject next month.
Will this give France the opportunity to invade the Isle of Jersey? So, it is either the silly season on all accounts. But on a more serious vein,
yes,
regarding Israel, the EU goes out of its way to characterize announcements of new building as a no-no. And the thing that's flamed a lot here in the United States regarding Mr. Blinken and Mr. Biden is the question of the, quote, resurrection of the Palestinian consulate.
Yes.
And that really has stoked intense resentment here among certain quarters in the American Jewish community who thought that, okay, Mr. Biden, this is the irony. Mr. Biden was the co-sponsor of the 1995 Embassy Act that permitted the movement of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv. The catch was the waiver that could be looked at every 6 months to determine whether or not that would happen.
At the right time, yeah.
Left to Mr. Trump and I guess. 18 to say enough is enough, let's move. That is really consternating stuff. And it now appears that there may have been speculation about whether this was a trade with Israel in the context of issuing these Palestinians.
The latest that I've been following this, if you look, my press review for Elnet is in French. I summarize in French articles in English. But when you get it, I just sent one around. When you get it, you have the link to the article in English. You don't need to read the resume in French. You just click and you can read the article in English and see what I'm following. I followed all this year. The return to the JCPOA. And according to what I read, They were not ready to make any significant compromise on the American side, and they didn't, and they haven't returned to the JCPOA. And it's now a moot question. And yet I constantly read articles in English saying the opposite. It's the same kind of thing for Zemmour. What? They don't say what can be verified. They say what they wish were true. But it's not like wishful thinking, because they say it as if it were true. The latest article I read said that the Americans said, well, we can't open the consulate without Israeli approval.
Right.
Okay. And the last point, because we don't want to go too long, but if you feared that a Biden administration would not be so good for Israel, what would be the strategy that makes sense? The strategy that makes sense would be to constantly give good arguments for good decisions. The strategy of saying they're lunatics, they're fascists, they're communists, they're out of their minds, they're half dead, he's not really the president, they're going to do this, they're going to, that doesn't make any sense. He's a real human being. He's free to choose and decide. And Blinken grew up in France with his stepfather, who was a survivor of the death camps. Do they think that Blinken has no feeling for Israel? Does he ever show it? Never, never. I mean, it's, I'm working on an article about that, because the level of insult, of dismissal, of inhuman vocabulary to talk about someone that happens not to be your party. But I think that you can tell democracy that way. And again, what you do, you read what you write, they'll do it, right? Somebody that goes and shoots someone that asks them to put on a mask, they're reading your article saying that it's a tyranny like Hitler to ask people to wear a mask. I don't accuse people of being responsible for the crimes that are committed based on their thought, but I would invite them to think for a minute whether that's a good strategy. And so for the JCPOA, they have not reintegrated it. Or we agree, it's too late, it won't happen, it can't happen now. Leaving the JCPOA accomplished something, but nothing happened after that to stop their development.
And from my vantage point, being as old as I am, I recall that when Israel attacked not only in 1981, the reactor in Iraq, and even in 2007, the so-called Syrian reactor, which is in fact a copy of the North Korean plutonium factory, it said nothing. And what disturbs me is there's too much chatter emanating out of Jerusalem about getting ready to do this, we must do that. And the answer is that for Israeli consumption, or is that basically to prod a combination of the EU3 and the US essentially to see what they can do to mollify essentially the crazy mullahs in Tehran?
Well,
now,
you know, they're consulting closely. If you want to look at the difference between the Obama regime, like the building in the settlements, you know, they'll say, oh, no, that's not so good for a two-state solution. And then the next day it's over. they're not on the case of Israel all the time with these things. They're consulting closely. They consult more with Israel than anyone else about Iran, much more with Israel than with the EU about Iran. And I'll be following that story in my next week's review for Elnet. I'll be following that story of the things that are coming out of Israel today about a potential attack on Iran. And we'll see where that goes.
With
So
that, I'm going to say thank you very much.
yes, no, I'm saying thank you very much.
And look for the transcript.
Right, and we'll be back to discuss beginning of December.
You got it.
Okay.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. À bientôt.
Agento.